Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Elisa Voisin will defend the academic thesis Modeling and Forecasting Economic Time Series with Mixed Causal-Non-Causal Models. May I invite you, Elisa to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis, please.
Dear members of the committee, colleagues, family and friends, I will now present you the content and the topic of my thesis. Before getting into the details, I would first like to define some terms and some concepts. So the first is what type of variable am I using in my thesis? So there are time series. So a time series is a variable that is measured regularly over time. It can be daily, weekly, monthly, as long as it is regular. So this is a fictional example of what would be my stress level in the past years had I been able to measure it every morning until this morning, all right? So every point is my daily stress level, and we connect them over time to create, to see the evolution over time. So 0 would be neutral, above it is stressed, below it is relaxed, all right? So what are we interested in? We want to be able to understand its evolution over time, and then use this understanding to make predictions, all right? So to do so, we will be using a model that uses the correlation over time. You can imagine that every morning I do not wake up having completely forgotten about my stress of the day before. So using this idea, we will use what's called autoregressive models. So you can see on the timeline the way days are related to one another. Every day is explained as a proportion of the leftover stress of the day before plus external factors triggering more or less stress every day. So based on the data that we have, we estimate it to be on average 80%. Could have been 20, 50, but the data showed that on average it was 80% from one day remaining to another. So this is why every arrow has 80%. So now what's happening in the highlighted part in green in the graph? On that day, I was supposed to go on holidays. In the morning, I hear there's a strike. I didn't know about it. I suddenly get stressed. Am I going to miss my trains, my flights, and so on? So there's a sudden spike in my stress. This is not part of the remaining stress of the day before because I didn't know about the strike. It is part of the external factors, all right? So this model is able to capture the effect of everything that has already happened in the past. Because external factors are the new shocks, and they're carried over with the arrows towards the next day, the 80%. So if we want to forecast, we increase the timeline. We are interested in forecasting the orange part, which we do not know and is in the future, given, so based on all the information that we know for sure. So all the stress from the first day to today. We can just look at the arrows going into tomorrow. We see that it's 80% of today, plus the external factors are on average 0, so they're forecasted to be 0. So if today is 10 at the top of the peak, then tomorrow is predicted to be 8, all right? We could also be interested in how likely it is that tomorrow the stress level drops back to 0, so no stress at all, given that today was actually 10, we were at the peak. And because the model is based on explaining a day as a function of the day before, we actually have a formula for it. We plug in the values, and we directly get how likely this is. So very straightforward, very nice, except that this model is unable to capture what's happening actually in the last weeks. So every day, I was getting more and more stressed as the defense would approach. So the defense hadn't happened yet, but it was already stressing me. So it's the opposite at the shock of the unpredictable strike. There I didn't know, suddenly it stresses me, and then it decays over time. Now it's the reverse. It's stressing me, stressing me, stressing me, and you can guess that tomorrow, or even in an hour, probably, the stress would have brought back to 0. So it's exactly mirrored. So because it is mirrored, we can then mirror the model. So now the arrows have switched. Every day is not a function of, is not explained as the remaining stress of the day before, but it is a proportion of the day after in anticipation of upcoming events that would stress me. So now to forecast, once again we increase the timeline. We want the orange part given the blue part, but now we look at the arrows going into tomorrow, And we see that the arrow comes from the day after tomorrow, which we do not know either, right? It's also a critique of these models. People say, you cannot do that, but you cannot forecast the future. That depends in further future, but it's actually feasible. It's just less straightforward, but feasible. So let's say we are still interested in how likely it is that tomorrow's stress level drops to 0, given that we are at the peak today. So for those of you who know a little bit of probability theory, we're using Bayes' rule. So we are able to rewrite the part in green, which we want to know, into components that either we know or are able to retrieve more easily. So we can rewrite the green part into the product of the blue and red. So blue is how likely was it that today would be 10 if tomorrow will be 0. And this is exactly how we build the model. Every day is a function of the day after, so we have a formula for this. We plug in values, we get it. Now the red part, if we do have a formula for it, it's how likely was it that today would be 10 and how likely it is that tomorrow will be 0, independent of everything else. If we have a formula for it, we plug in values and we can directly retrieve the green part. But sometimes we do not have formula for it, and then we need to approximate them as well. And this will bring me to the first chapter of my thesis. But before, just a general definition of the models, because I've said only one past value or only one future value, but turns out the general model can have multiple past and multiple future values. So they are defined as MAR, so mixed causal, non-causal, autoregressive models, and R, the MAR RS. R will be how many past, and S how many futures. The equation is just for people who know autoregressive models and time series, just to show how the model looks like for anyone interested. The lag polynomial is multiplied by the lead, so the one created the future values. So now that you know the concept of the model and the idea, I will present the content of my chapters. So the first chapter is an analysis of two methods that are used to approximate approximation methods to forecast MAR models. In the case where the fraction of the red component that I showed you 2 slides ago, we do not have a formula for them. But methods in general are developed for regular distributions or regular time periods. But a key characteristic of MAR models is that they can capture extreme episodes, such as the bubbles. So bubbles are persistent increase followed by a sudden crash, the same as the way the defense was affecting my stress level. And these episodes are even more frequent under more extreme distributions. So what we do in this chapter is that we investigate the strengths and weaknesses of the methods in order to understand how they work in regular but also extreme time periods and with more regular and extreme distributions. What I mean with distributions is the way the external factors happen. We model them in the model. So we give guidance and guidance to interpret the results and how to use each of the methods. Another important thing that we emphasize is to use predictive density and not point forecast. So not to say what's the most likely value to happen tomorrow, but instead how likely are every potential outcome. Because as we go along a bubble during an explosive episode, there's not just one most likely value, there's actually 2 events. Either it's gonna drop or gonna keep on increasing. And this would not be captured by just a model that looks at the back, so the backward model with only the past values, or if we were just giving a point forecast, so just what's the most likely value. Chapter 3 and 4 are applications of MAR models and forecasts. They also address different econometric issues. Chapter 3 is an analysis of crude oil prices. Its focus is on the impact of detrending the data on MAR model estimations. What do I mean with detrending? Most models are built for series that fluctuates around a flat line. You can see from crude oil prices that the beginning is much lower than the end. So the question is, what is the trend? We do not know it, and we want to keep as much as dynamics and information in the data. So maybe it is this straight line, but doesn't really seem so. It would mean that prices on average go the same way, like by the same amount every month, but doesn't seem so. So then we can add waves to the trend. Could be this one, we don't really know, but then I can add even more waves to it. with this purple line. But this would actually take way too much information from the data. We want to keep as much as possible and just make it flat. So the question is, how many waves should I have? And this brings us to also consider the Hodrick-Prescott filter. While being quite criticized, it at least does not require to decide already how many waves to have, and we can actually even penalize beforehand how smooth it should be. So we do simulation analysis on the impact of each of them on simulations of on estimations of MER models, and then based on those results from the simulations, we then apply different detrending to oil prices. So now you see 4 series that have been detrending using different methods. So oil prices detrending with 4 different methods. They are a bit different, they're quite different, but quite similar as well, right? We then estimate MER models, and we find it in MER 1, all of them. So 1 past value and 1 future value. And then we forecast the probability that oil prices will crash or crash even further following the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. So every month, how likely is it that it will drop and drop again, or drop 45%? I mean, we give different magnitudes of drop. And then we compare these based on the different detrending, so keeping in mind the simulations that we had done before and the results from them. And we do so looking back in time, but also as if we had done it in real time following actually the outbreak of COVID. Chapter 4, we analyze inflation rate in Brazil, and it's rather a stable period compared to the more volatile period of the COVID-19 pandemic for the oil prices. Inflation in the past has undergone hyperinflation. So before the timeline that I'm showing here, in the 1990s, it reached 7,000% year on year. So here it's maximum 15, right, to give you an idea. And so now we can agree that it's rather stable. And as part of the stabilization plan, the central bank started an inflation targeting system. So they announced an inflation target and allow some tolerance bonds around it. So these are the dashed line that you can see on the graph. Those are the tolerance bonds, and the inflation target is exactly in the middle. Another thing is that inflation data is never available on the moment, right? For instance, to know the inflation rate of November, it was actually just released a few days ago, right? So you always have to wait for the month after. So if in November we want to forecast the inflation rate of December, then we actually have to wait for December, and then it's also a bit, then it's not really real time, right? So Brazil has a database called the Focus database, which consists of daily forecasts and revisions of many economic variables made by a wide range of experts. So it actually allows to perform real-time analysis, because we can then use the latest forecast, which is actually updated every day, as the value for the inflation rate, for instance, or the other variables. So we then forecast 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months ahead the probability that the inflation rate will be within the bounds. We also consider the additional variables, key economic variables, which is allowed thanks to the Focus database. And we actually find that at 6 months ahead, it's almost 50-50. It's a bit too uncertain, and the variables didn't really add information. So the most valuable forecast that we have is the 1 month ahead, and we suggest to use it as a short-term credibility index. So how likely it is of the central bank, so how likely it is that they actually meet the target. So this is on the right graph. Those are monthly probability that the inflation rate will be within the bounds between 2008 and 2017. So every month we do it, and it's the evolution. So 1 will be very surely it's going to be between the bounds, 0, very unlikely. And if I tell you that there's a 40% probability that it will be within the bounds, do you consider it as credible or not? It's a bit arbitrary. So then we suggest a tool that helps choose adequately based on some trade-off what should be the threshold. Chapter 5 and 6 are more generalizations or extensions of MER models. So chapter 5 allows for more than one future value, because until then, only one was enough in the data that we had, but it could be, in some data set, it's needed to have more. And this chapter is a combination of ideas and results, some of them still quite partial. So at first, we wanted to perform the same benchmark analysis that we did in chapter 2, allowing for 2 future values, but we were not able to find the formula, the theoretical formula that would serve as a benchmark. So we still show the point that to which we got, but it's still for further research. We then suggest a new forecasting method that actually combines the 2 existing ones in order to counter some of the drawbacks that each of them might have in certain situations. So for instance, it would be a suitable alternative when we would like to have the complete predictive density, so how likely are every potential outcome of a rather explosive episode from a small sample size. So we provide some comparisons with simulations and also a real-life example. Chapter 6, we consider the idea of common bubbles. So the fact that the anticipative effect within the data would be common to a group of variables. So now, instead of having just one variable, we have multiple variables, all influenced by the past and future of all the others simultaneously. So it's a much bigger model with many more coefficients. So the commonalities, if we could detect them, would be valuable information, but would also help reduce the amount of coefficients. So we suggest a test to detect the commonalities, and also model information criterion to select one or the 2 models. So there are 2 different methods. We do simulations to show the performance of all of them. We find that the test performs quite well, even under quite extreme distributions. And we show an example to show how it's to apply it in practice. And this concludes my thesis. Thank you for your attention. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will be open by Chair of the Assessment Committee, Professor Dr. Bertrand Candelon, Professor in Finance, Université Catholique de Louvain, and Honorary Professor in International Finance of this House.
Thank you, Mr. the Prorector. Dear candidate, so first of all, I would like to congratulate you for this nice work. I think it's a quite topical subject, in particular today, because the European Commission has decided to cap the price of gas to avoid the bubble on this market, the bubble that we suffer during the summer. So that's topical. For that analysis, you use types of model, the mixed causal, non-causal model, and I very appreciate the way you present the chapters. So there is a progression. You see really from the univariate model at the beginning, the MAR, from the multivariate model at the end. And so that's quite interesting for non-specialists like me. Despite you have the drawback that at the end, for example, from the oil market, we say, okay, why not at the beginning considering a univariate model to understand the oil market bubbles? But you published the paper, so already congratulations, it's on the box. So, my question will, of course, deal with the last chapter, the ongoing and developing paper, which analyze or investigate the oil market and the commonality between different raw commodities. And then you consider metal, food, and so on. There are theories behind to say that there is huge commonalities between raw commodities. But then I would like to know why, following theories like this, you didn't consider financial asset, a reference financial asset, in order to test for the financiarization of raw commodities, because we know that raw commodities are not only input for production, but also financial asset. And I would like to know what would it leads if you consider stock indices, any stock indices for the result. Do you find commonalities? And the corollary question could be to see if you think that these common bubbles has been more probable in the present, in the recent past, rather than in the long past, because we have observed that there is a recorrelation of oil, in particular, to financial market, that creates a lot of issues for oil exporting countries, because it's very linked to the financial market, and it does not help them to diversify their investment. So I would like your point of view on these two questions.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. So to answer the first question, whether adding financial assets to the model, do you mean adding them to the model with the commodities or having a separate model with just financial assets?
Common bubbles with financial market, typically 2008, where you have a collapse of the stock market, or does it match with do you have a common bubble with raw commodities?
So we could have, it could have been the case, of course, that to find commonalities in the forward-looking component with financial assets as well. But when the model, we have an issue with multivariate is the estimation. It takes a lot of time, I mean, at least in how it is right now. So we did test on other types of variables, but we didn't have enough time to actually try with many others and actually test whether there are common bubbles until we find an example for which it works, or whether we could have found it. I do think that we can find commonalities, common bubbles in financial assets, the same in parallel to the commodity market. I'm not sorry, I'm not sure whether you mean two different models or one that could explain with financial markets, explain the commodity market. It's going all over the head.
Perhaps one model that explains the financialization of raw commodities, and
the
common bubble between financial market and the
okay,
market.
yes, yeah. So I don't really know much of the theory on all of that, but I do think we could find commonalities. Another thing that we suggest in the chapter is that now we really kind of force it to have one type of structure, but it could also be delayed. A different dynamics in the maybe one lag, not just having it at exactly the same time, but maybe financial market or raw commodity could impact with a lag other variables in different dynamics. Or not at all.
Then you have a problem of identification. But okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, I'm not knowledgeable at all on the in the actual theory of the financial market and commodity prices. The idea was just we saw some similarity in the data, and we wondered, would that mean that there's a commonality in commodities? And we, at least in the way we tested, did not find it. But I could imagine that potentially, with all the data, it would be the case. To answer your second question, whether I think whether it would be more common in the past or in the future, I would think it's more common now, as in with globalization. There's much more connection between variables and dependence across variables, countries, markets. So I would expect, once again, that it's more common nowadays, but it's my guess, raw guess.
Thank you. The position will be continued by Professor John Chasser, Professor of Economics, York University, Toronto, Canada. John?
Thank you, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidate, I enjoyed a lot reading your thesis. Congratulations on this fine piece of work. In your thesis, you have examined the performance of two forecasting procedures. I'd like you to elaborate on the effect of estimation error and model specification error on the forecasting accuracy and forecast intervals in these two methods.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. So we indeed, for now, do not take into account estimation error or bounds around the coefficients. One of the methods, which is based on simulations, only use the estimated coefficient once, so to say. We estimate the model, so there the coefficients have an impact on, the errors have an impact on the estimation there, and then it's based on simulations of those coefficients. Whereas the other method based on sample-based, so we'd use again the sample, the filtered sample, so we estimate the model, then we filter using those coefficients, and then we use this filtered sample in order to approximate. So I would expect that maybe the second method, the simulations-based method, might be slightly more sensitive to the errors in estimation. This is not something we take into account, especially when we do predictive density. I don't really know how we would add this uncertainty, because it would change not only how it moves horizontally, but also the shape of the density, but it would be, I don't see how to exactly include it in the forecast, but I would expect at least in the sensitivity of each of the method that the simulation-based methods be more sensitive to estimations. Does this answer your question?
Yes, and the misspecification, model misspecification error effect?
Do you mean getting the wrong lags? Or
yes, for example, using the wrong model specification in general causal instead of non-causal, for example, or misspecifying the lags or leads, as you said.
And then which of the method is more sensitive to that, or just the effect of it?
What follows from your experience? What do you think, what your intuition tells you?
So having too many leads or too many lags shouldn't affect too much. At least as long as there should be one, having two shouldn't affect too much. But creating a lead when there should not be would have a quite drastic impact, because we then get also completely different. First, it makes forecast much more complicated, so less also precise with all the approximations, and the density forecast we obtain are also completely different. So creating forward values that should not be there, adding them when they should not be there, or forgetting them, especially if we also forget them and only have past values, then we also lose a lot of information, because especially at the bimodality of forecasts, when there should be future values, this would be completely lost. And also, also the coefficients we would obtain might also look a bit extreme, especially if we forget future values, we can get close to unit root coefficients, or so this would also impact the estimation.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition is continued by the member of the assessment committee, Professor Jean-Michel Zakarian, Professor of Financial Econometrics of CREST.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, so I read the thesis with great pleasure and interest. I think it is at the cutting edge of the recent research on the topic of non-causal modeling. So my question is also about the last chapter on multivariate models and the common bubble behaviors between several time series. So there are obvious analogies with between your test and the one which is used for testing co-integration. But an important difference, I think, is that co-integration is only a matter of the coefficients of the model, whereas the occurrence of the bubble does not only depend on the model parameters, but also on the presence of large shocks. So without such shocks, you don't have any bubble, even if your parameters satisfy the assumption. So I wonder whether it wouldn't be better to call the null assumption common non-causal components rather than common bubble. To do rather a comment more than question. And now, given for your, how do you exactly interpret your null assumption for this test? And in particular, does it say anything about the delay of occurrence between bubbles in different time series? Could it be tested? And last point on this assumption is how it can be used for practical purpose, like in co-integration. When you have detected co-integration, it has important modeling consequences. I wonder, in your case, if you have common, say, bubbles, what consequences do you draw? Good. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words and remarks. Indeed, we call it common bubbles to make it easier than common non-causal components, but indeed it does not need to have actual bubbles or actual shocks to happen. It's just that the data, of course, that we consider have bubbles, have had bubbles in the past. So in the null hypothesis that we have, we test whether every single coefficient matrix in the forward-looking component can be reduced. So whether the structure is exactly the same for each of the leads. This was the very first test we did, and we built it like this. But of course, we could also try different structure, test different structures. As long as we can apply restrictions on the matrix, we could then decide which restrictions to impose, and then do the likelihood ratio test. So these, multivariate MAR models have two different representation. They're equivalent when we have the additive model, but they have two different multiplicative representation. And the one that starts with the lead polynomial is the one that is used to impose the restrictions, because it's the easiest way to actually test it. And we actually could test any restrictions on the lead polynomials. We just impose it that it's exactly the same everywhere, but we could impose any type of delay. So no commonalities with the first, but then with the second. In some of the variables, we could even decide, I guess, just one variable influencing others. I think it would be possible to easily impose some restrictions that are not exactly the way we do it, because we simplify it to be exactly the same everywhere, but it would be possible. For the purpose, we suggest, for instance, in portfolio management, having commonalities, knowing that some stock prices, for instance, are caused by same factors, also help understanding the risks that are involved in the portfolio. And we can then also have a combination of them that does not have a forward-looking component anymore, like somehow cancels out. This is one of the ideas that we have in more practical terms.
Thank you. Next, I would like to give the floor to member of the assessment committee, Dr. Stefan Smekes, associate professor of econometrics of this house.
Dear candidate, dear Elisa, I also first want to congratulate you with your very nice thesis, which answered many questions I've always had about non-causal models, in particular about how to use them for forecasting. Thankfully, there are also some questions remaining, so I can just ask one. And my question is not related to a particular chapter, it's a more general question. You often motivate the usefulness of non-causal models as a relatively simple way to model non-linear features, or non-linear looking features like bubbles. In particular, you motivate that through the use of saying that these non-causal models are easier when you use them for forecasting. than several other models, which I guess is a question whether this is really the case, which is not really the point of my question. My question is more about, say I am an applied researcher and I want to analyze a series which has these kind of bubbles, maybe your stress level series, for instance. And I'm not particularly interested in forecasting, but maybe I'm more interested in learning deeper about what are the properties of this series. Can I distinguish, based on the data, between whether I should use your non-causal model or I should use some fancy non-linear model? And if I could, or even if I couldn't, suppose I would be able to make a decision, is there a deeper meaning to that? Can I give some sort of deeper structural or economic meaning, if you want, to whether a non-causal model or some non-linear model is more appropriate?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. To answer your question, using a I also say, so when I say it's a simple model, it's not necessarily for forecasting, but more so for modeling. I do think it's quite straightforward, at least in the estimation of the model. Using if you're not interested in forecasting, but you want to model and explain more the dynamics, indeed you can use a more technical, complex model, a nonlinear model. But I guess this one also already requires some understanding of the dynamics and also some assumption on the nonlinearity and maybe some theory already. I think the mixed causal, non-causal models, to me, are straightforward after working on them for so long, in the sense that they also only use the correlation over time and consider the leftover effects and the anticipative effects. And they are able to capture quite nonlinear dynamics. Now we only consider mostly positive coefficients to have this bubble pattern, but it could be with a negative coefficient, also some volatility increasing, then decreasing again, depending. So I think they also offer quite some flexibility. I do find them straightforward. I wouldn't, if someone, of course, has a whole theory and built for a certain type of variable, maybe this one would be fit better. So maybe when we do not really know, when we don't have a whole built theory about how some time series is evolving over time, then I think it's better to use MER models than a wrong, nonlinear model, but that's my opinion, and because I also I've been working quite a lot with MER models, and I'm trying to convince everyone. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. The position will be continued by Dr. Sean Tell, from assistant professor from Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. Dear candidate, dear Elisa, also from my side, congratulations on writing a very nice thesis. I will promise you that it will be on my desk in the upcoming probably years to come, because I mean, you know, this is also my topic. And that's why I'm actually still going to continue my question on what Stefan actually started with. I'm going to play a little bit devil's advocate here. So that's your opinion. I'm going to ask you the question, why is it actually interesting for empirical researchers? Why is this model easy? Because if it's a purely non-causal model, you could say it's linear in its parameters, but a MAR is not. The models are non-nested, so in terms of model selection, that might be difficult. You might have problems with starting values, as you probably also have seen, which is a very difficult thing to deal with. Complicated error distributions, etc. So what is actually the intuitive appeal of this MAR model, essentially? That is one thing. And then the second element to this is, you did a lot of detrending methods, because we often observe bubbles. Well, as you have seen, or as you have said, basically, you need to flatten this out. There are also people that are claiming that this is not, let's say, a bubble type of pattern on a deterministic trend, but rather a random walk, essentially, driving it. How do your results in chapter 3, if I remember carefully, how do they basically hold if you have a random walk instead of one of these deterministic functions? Is that yeah?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your nice words. So the appeal, the first question regarding the appeal. Indeed, they're non-nested, but we first, it's a step-by-step approach to estimate. So we first test the autocorrelation, so how many lags or, how many days or months or periods are correlated with one another. And then indeed we test every one of them. As you said, it's straightforward, it's linear when we only have one lag or one lead. It becomes non-linear when we have more. But there is also this, we can write it into a linear form. So the coefficients themselves, of course, are non-linear, multiplication and so on. But at least once we estimate the model, then we can transform it into a linear model. So with this, it can also help understanding what exactly is the impact of the lag and what exactly is the impact of the lead. So the way we estimate is non-linear, but then we get coefficients and we can just interpret them like this. So I still do think for practitioners, it is still rather straightforward to estimate, even with extreme distributions. In practice, rarely do we find a normal distribution. It's very often rejected anyway. And with, for instance, student T, if it was actually normal, we would get very high degrees of freedom. So it also offers, with student T, the one we are considering mostly in this thesis, offers quite some flexibility as to whether it should be extreme or not. Cauchy distribution is, of course, way too extreme, even though it's quite nice in terms of playing around, but it's too extreme. But student T offers quite some flexibility. For practitioners, I still do think once there's not many coefficients to estimate. There's two, plus the distribution, but if there's only one lag, one lag, for instance, we can already capture quite some dynamics. And with only two coefficients to estimate, I think it's quite appealing. But it would depend if they have also a whole theory, then maybe it's easier to build a model based on the theory that they have. But without a theory, I suppose less coefficient that captures more complex dynamics is also quite appealing. Regarding the detrending, we indeed only consider deterministic or at least mechanical detrending. It could be a random walk type of trend, but then we would also then get rid of a lot of information within the data, because then we take already quite a lot of autocorrelation from it, which we really try not to do. So this is another, it would clearly affect a lot the data that we have, because then maybe once we detrend with such a trend, we do not have a forward-looking component anymore. We do try to really limit how it fluctuates and keep this bubble pattern. Maybe it is not a bubble, maybe we should model it completely differently, but while reading some papers on oil prices, because there's a paper about oil prices, there were so many different models. It was even argued whether it was stationary or not. So I think there's a lot of not much agreement on what to do. I suppose if we practice a lot of different models with modeling and forecasting, the best one will win. But yes, it could be a completely different type of trends. It's just that we decided to really use the ones that leave as much as possible of the dynamics in the data, assuming that these are bubbles. But that's an assumption we make for the paper.
Thank you very much.
The position is continued by Dr. Stefan Stratmans, Associate Professor of Finance of this house.
Dear candidate, dear Elisa, I would first of all like to join my predecessors here in praising your work. I think it's very well written and constitutes a nice balance between econometric theory and applications. Now, as a financial economist, I would like to focus more on the economics of your story, and not as much on the hardcore econometrics. And I would therefore, first of all, go with you to chapter 3, and more specifically page 56, where you refer to the present value model for stock valuation in kind of motivation at the start of your chapter on oil price predictions. And the solution of this model in equation 3.2, which is basically some kind of stochastic difference equation, leads to, like also differential equations that are linear. You have a particular solution and a homogeneous solution. In this case, it's a fundamental component and a bubble component. Now, the problem, of course, is, and you also mentioned that actually for oil prices, it's not that clear what the fundamental is. And in the stock price example, it's dividends. So therefore, first of all, I was a bit puzzled why you mentioned that equation, but maybe you can explain that a little bit better now. And then as a second part of my question, a little bit later in the chapter, you talk about these filtering procedures that you also investigate in terms of their performance and their optimality. So you try to filter out the non-stationarity to make them stationary before fitting the MAR models. And so basically you have this decomposition of your series in two components. Now, could I interpret what you call the stochastic trend that you then want to remove? Could that maybe be this fundamental part of your equation 3.2? So is that capturing the dividends, for example, if you were doing on stock prices? Or is it capturing the money growth differentials if you model exchange rates, etc.? So I'm happy to listen to your answer.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your words, kind words. Regarding equation 3.2 in chapter 3, we indeed wanted to make the bridge between price valuation and the fundamental trend, the fundamental price, and the bubble part of a price. Indeed, we do not know what the trend is at all, and we do not really intend on calling the trend that we retrieve from the data as the fundamental price. What we do instead is, we can expect that somehow the trend that we estimate would follow, or at least the part that would be a bubble would be still a bubble from the fundamental or from the trend that we retrieve. And it's also why we consider, we don't really do point forecasts, but more probabilities of crash or very large crash. And we do hope that these are less affected by the trend that we estimate. But indeed, we do not estimate the fundamental trend per se. We do not know it. We just wanted to make the bridge between the literature on this. Regarding the second question, whether we do not want to leave out to take away any stochastic trend. This is also an assumption that we make, that indeed everything that's left in the data that we is not part of a trend. Once again, just an assumption. We really just want to leave out as much as the dynamics. In the leftover dynamics, possible that there is still some trends. All we do is try to remove a smooth trend without affecting the dynamics. So that's the main what we try to do in this chapter. But indeed, we do not know the fundamental trend in oil prices, and we do not claim to know it either with the trend that we have. Any other applications, you mentioned this, or stock markets or dividends, this will clearly require more assumptions or more understanding on the theory itself, because indeed it could be that we leave things from the trend in the data, or vice versa, that we take from it. But in this chapter, we really just And that's what we do also in the simulations. We fix the trend, a deterministic trend, and then just apply MAR models. So it's really for this particular case, if it's an MAR model, how are the trends affecting the estimation? So we do assume that what's left is an MAR model, MAR process, and we interpret the results in such a way, but it's a big assumption, of course, especially on oil prices. It's just the assumption we are making to write this chapter.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition is continued by Dr. Jacob Rijmakers, Assistant Professor of Statistics, Quantitative Economics, Maastricht University.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Elisa, I'd also like to join my colleagues in congratulating you with this very nice piece of work. I enjoyed reading the thesis and learning about these type of models. They were new to me. Regarding my question, I have a question on your empirical study in section 2 and 3, where, for example, let's say on page 77, what you tend to do is, or what you do is you define some kind of extreme event, let's say a decrease of 1 standard deviation or of a certain percentage, and then you focus on a certain bubble, and you see whether the probabilities suggested by your model sort of indicate this extreme event, right, or suggest it. So my question is, instead of focusing on a single bubble or single extreme event, both of the time series that you use are quite old, so my guess is that there would be multiple bubbles in there. Could you essentially evaluate your method over the whole time series, also in time points where there are no bubbles, and then, for example, compare the probabilities that come out of your model with the observed events? So you observed whether or not there was an extreme event, yes or no. This would maybe with an evaluation function like something you would use in logistic regression or something. So I would like to know, was there a specific motivation for this choice, or your thoughts on that?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your kind words. So in chapter 3, we indeed look at a more volatile period with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic. But during in chapter 4, with the inflation rate, we look at a rather stable period. So we wanted to focus once on extreme event, more extreme, and another chapter in more regular time periods. We could indeed forecast some probability, because we do not point forecast but density forecast, which is why we focus then on probabilities of events. We could also do point forecast or precise probabilities on the whole sample, and then we could indeed just look at the performance. But I guess we would then also have to compare it with other methods. So this is why it's out of the scope of each of the chapter, because we really wanted to show how to forecast with the methods, with the 2 different approximation methods, how they perform both in extreme event and regular time period. And we also try to do it real time and also in sample. So we have already a lot of, so that's why we decided to not first do the whole sample of forecast. We sometimes try to do a few months or but never the whole sample. But this, of course, would be a good exercise to compare first with other methods when the theory does not, when there's many theories or many different methods that are used for some certain data set. This could be absolutely a good exercise to be done. And yes, we decided to show extreme events because the key characteristic of MAR models is that they can capture such extreme events. So we thought, of course, forecasting regular time period is mostly going to be unimodal, so point forecast and less likely as we go further away from it. But during extreme episodes, there's really this bimodality in the data, which we really wanted to show how the models were capturing it. Because this cannot be captured by a backward-looking model. So that's why we also don't compare. I mean, one of the chapters, I think I think in chapter 3, I'm also comparing once. I'm showing how the predictive density would look like if we only had backward model. So I'm showing it once, but it really to emphasize that we would lose information, at least in this bimodality, if we were only using backward model. But of course, other types of exercise to compare with other models, to look over the whole sample, to actually look at the performance of whether it happened, how likely was the event that happened, how likely was it to happen in our forecast. This could clearly be done, but it was always difficult for us to decide on how to interpret or present probabilities, because probability is just a probability, and then we always struggled a bit on how do we evaluate whether it was a good probability or not, right? It's always a bit difficult. So that's why also in chapter 4 we find this to decide on some thresholds on is it too high or too low probability compared to a trade-off between true and false positive. So we offer this as a tool to then decide. I hope this answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Since time permits, let's get started with the second round of questions. And I would like to give again the floor to John. Well, you came from Canada, so you have a privilege to ask the second question.
Yeah, thank you. Dear candidate, my second question will be more general. For many years, the Box-Jenkins approach for time series estimation and identification has remained the most predominant method of time series analysis. Could you please discuss its shortcomings in application to nonlinear and non-causal processes?
Highly esteemed opponent. Yes.
That's the basic method for causal processes. That's what I mean by Box-Jenkins. Estimating the ACFs, then plotting the ACFs, estimating by maximum likelihood based on the Gaussian distribution, and so on.
So I know very well that, because it's also in Sean's thesis, a lot on the estimations. To be frank, I don't really remember exactly how the Box-Jenkins method.
Dear candidate, thank you very much for the last question, for addressing the last question. The time appointed for defending of your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw and discuss the quality of your thesis as well as the defense. And I request you and your friends, colleagues, to wait in this room for our deliberation. We will return soon. Thank you.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 7 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goals only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if there's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and that. Oh, 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 oh. your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. The mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. Even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side, no place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Dear candidate, Elisa Maria Voisin, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account all your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Heck is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom, and I invite Alain to now take the floor.
Please all rise.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Elisa Marie Voisin, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. They told me that I have 2 hours, so I've prepared a lot of... So, dear Elisa, dear Dr. Voisin, congratulations for this achievement that crowns a long journey here in Maastricht, a journey of hard work, I mean, that is what I saw, and noticed, and also apparently a journey of a lot of fun that you wrote in your acknowledgement to your thesis. Je tiens aussi à féliciter tes parents qui t'ont toujours soutenu lors de toutes ces années. En tout cas, tu ne t'es jamais plaint que tu devais rentrer chez toi pour les vacances, que ce n'est pas toujours évident. Et ça a été un plaisir d'encadrer Elisa durant ces 4 années. When you think that some people have to prepare some sentences in Portuguese or in Chinese for some PhD students, it's much easier for me this time. Anyway, so the first time I heard about you, Elisa, was from Jean-Pierre. So Jean-Pierre talked about what he called the Belgian couple. That means you were quite often with Simon, and because of that, he believed that you were Belgian as well. But when you decide to do your bachelor thesis with me, and you approach me for this topic on realized volatility, I quickly realized that you were not Belgian, right? with your strange accent. So they do not say wet like we say in French, but wheat. So
Almost.
But I have to train, so I'm not good yet. So you see that probably on both sides, Jean-Pierre is not or was not very accurate with everything, right? Then it was at that time. Yes, at that time you approached me for the bachelor thesis. I didn't know you, and I didn't know if you were a good student or not, because the first thing you ask me when you enter in my room is that, can I do it with reviews? So at the time, so now you see the progress. I don't want to compare reviews with R, but at that time you were looking for a topic that you could do using eViews, because this is the package we learned in econometrics when you were a bachelor student. So then you did the research master, and as you confess once, because I asked you why did you do the research master and not the usual master, you didn't want to stop your study, so you didn't want to decide yet what to do. Still, you don't know, right? so that didn't change, and this is why you did the master to have more time. Maybe one PhD is not enough. You can do a second one. And you did the master in 2 years, and during the second year, you were my research assistant. So Sean was still there, and I propose you to work on the follow-up of the thesis of Sean. That means to work with mixed causal, non-causal models, and in particular the complicated issue, which is forecasting with those models. That was not obvious. I should say that now I had 5 PhD students working on this topic, and I start to slowly understand the main issues, main problem with those models. It's far from being obvious. I was in London this weekend. I presented your paper, you see. And the question I had is, yes, but how can you forecast with leads? It's not possible. So then I refer to you. But I refer to Elisa. But usually, you know, when you present the work with a PhD student, you have, especially someone who is finishing, you have to say, yes, she's on the job market, but for you, I cannot say that because I had no clue what you wanted to do. Anyway, so as a research master, you were top, I don't know how many research master on your cohort, but you were the first one, and then you could decide to come with us and to do a PhD. Then you came to my office again. I do not know what to do. Should I do it or not? Can I stay? So we talk a lot, and I force you, right?
Yeah. There was a knife involved. And
well, quite sometimes you have to force women.
No.
And sometimes you have to pay women, because not only I forced you, but I pay you a trip to Marseille
that is true.
to go to a conference. It was not very expensive because, to be honest, I used Jean-Pierre money to send you there.
Jean-Pierre helped us.
But he was not there anymore to complain, unfortunately. Where am I in my improvisation? So, yes, I wanted to say that indeed you were not sure to stay with us, but fortunately I'm quite happy that you stay with us. You have worked very hard during these four years, especially during this difficult time of the COVID. You cannot attend. Yes, it was one of the commitments that we had during those discussions to force you to be a PhD student, that you could go abroad and go to conferences, right? Because you wrote in your thesis, in your acknowledgement, that I told you that 4 years is enough. You don't tell you the whole story. You also told me that you spent half of your life in Maastricht, almost, and that you knew everything already and you want to do something else. So that means, this is why I told you, yes, but we go to conferences, you present your work, you have a good friend with mustache, and so on. But some of the projects have been cancelled, like we had to go to Japan, but it has been cancelled. And other conferences and nice conferences have been cancelled, but you managed to travel. And in particular, for instance, you spent 3 months in Rome to visit Professor Kubada and to work with him on the paper that everyone complains on the last chapter. That means if someone has some problem with that chapter,
you can call him.
So I'm also grateful to Gianluca to host you, but also to work with you and with me on this project, as well as João Isler, that is also a co-author of the paper. You didn't have time to travel the way we wanted, but as you know, we go to Rio in. Did you tell them that we go to your parents that we go to? Okay.
Yeah, so they know.
So we go to Rio in January and to work and to polish our paper on Brazilian inflation. We should stay in contact for that because you need to know how to behave in Brazil, given that when you arrived in Rome, you lost your wallet, say like this. So this is, you have to know how to behave in Rio about this. Yes, I wanted to also say that you are a good teacher. That means all the students, when I read the positive evaluation, they were very happy with your commitments as a tutor for my course, Econometric Methods. What is, yes, they were happy. No, but they commented to me because the first 2 years in a row we teach online, right? When they saw you for the first time, they didn't realize you were so small. You see? But now you have, yes?
And I'm here.
Yes, you are not
that small.
Not that small. But anyway, that was the only complaint about the student, that you were smaller than expected. Now I complain enough about you. I would like, on behalf of your co-supervisor, Ines, and myself, to thank the assessment committee. We have the chance to have Bertrand Codelon here, and not only on television, right? Because he spends a lot of time and is very busy. I'm also grateful to Joanne Jaziak, who postponed her flight back to Toronto because she was in London for 2 days to attend your thesis. To Jean-Michel, I would like to thank Jean-Michel Zacoyan, who came for 1 day. He arrived just before your thesis, and he leaves before the drink, or just before, due to some, I mean, he has to do that. And also I would like to thank the other members of the committee, Sean, Stefan, and Stefan, the twins, and Jacob. Of course, they don't come from Canada, but still they read and assess your thesis in a nice way. So coming back to you and to finish, I have, you can imagine, no clue what you did since August, right? So I'm not your father, so you don't have to tell me, but I also not clue about what you are going to do in the future. If I can give you some hints about some stuff that you can improve, I have 3 of them, so try to wake up before 10 a.m. in the morning. The second one is to answer more frequently to emails. We never know if you are around or not. And the third one, be careful and keep an eye on your wallet and your bag. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Dear Dr. Voisin, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with this degree and with all the achievements. And with this, I would like to finish this academic ceremony. There are 2 announcements, very short ones. So the